Lil used to sing this one to me when I was a little girl when she'd babysit me on the farm.
A winsome mist of seven, a land just full of fun, beneath the cherry blossoms, were swinging in the sun. Of course, to keep from falling, his arms around her strayed, while softly in singing as they swing.
So I was born in Hamel, Minnesota, on the farm on April 6, 1907. And according to my mother, they were joyous years. She loved the farm. And it was always a big thing when the people from Minneapolis, the relatives, would come out. And they always told about one time when my uncle, her brother, and his gang of boys were in a ball game, and they came out to the farm to play the...
Give his name. Why don't you tell his name?
It was Leon LaFave.
Okay.
Her maiden name was LaFave. And they came out and played ball. And of course, my mother and our family, they rooted for the city ball team, and then they weren't very popular with the Hamel gang. But anyway, they laughed about it and how they put up the boys in the barn and the haymow. They slept there. It was always a big time. My mother and her family came from Maine, Lewiston, Maine, in 1882. And their parents had immigrated from Canada, and they settled in Maine. But they came to Minnesota in 1882 because of the working condition. There was no child labor laws, and there was a lot of children working in the textile mills there in Maine, and they didn't want that. So they came. They heard about Minnesota, how wonderful it was here, so they came here. But they settled in the city, in Minneapolis. In fact, the house is still there at 1309 5th Street Northeast. And, well, anyway, their good friends, one of the neighbors from Maine, had come, but they went on the farm. They took up land. They were farmers.
What was their
And
name?
Delorier, and they were neighbors of the Hamels
In Hamel.
in Hamel, and because after they gravitated to where there were French people, and my mother and their family used to go out there and spend time, maybe spend a summer visiting, with their good friends on the farm. That's their main enjoyment was visiting. Came on the train on one of these trips. I don't remember now if the trashing crew was over to the Hamels with the Delorier. No, it must have been the Hamels was over to. They all helped one another, the farmers, and my father was over to Delorier's, and he saw that beautiful girl sitting on the hay rack, and he winked at her. And that's the way they flirted in those days. They think. They got acquainted, and it was letters, and Bill has the love letters that he wrote to her. This started in 1896. I think they corresponded, and he came to Minneapolis on the bicycle a few times, but it was a rare occasion, and then he'd have to spend the night. But it was very, very well chaperoned, and most of their courtship was done. He was awfully thirsty, and in those days they had a water pail sitting on the what would you call it, a dry sink, where they drank, and she'd have to go and give him the drink, so they'd get a little smoochy. Otherwise, there was none. I suppose Grandma and Grandpa, they must have known what it was all about. The summer kitchen actually was part of the first shack that was on. Well, it's 1309 Fifth Street.
Yeah.
Anyway, Grandpa was a carpenter, so he added on to it many times. But anyway, my mother and father, they courted like that with letters and occasional visits for about 8 months. My mother, they came with her family. There were 3 children, and there was a couple of them that died. One was, she married, the oldest one was Leonie Coulomb. And then, of course, my mother, and her name was Emily Lafayette. Her maiden name was Lafayette. And then there was quite a few years between my mother and this other sister. Her name was Medora Lafayette Cunningham. But there was 2 or 3 that died in between. And then, of course, my uncle, they had only one boy that survived, and his name was Leon Lafayette, and was named for his father. My mother was 7 years old when they came. Her birthday was October 11th, 1875. And getting back to Grandma Lafayette, when they came here, in 1882, there weren't many doctors or many undertakers and nurses or whatever. And Grandma was the one that went around and helped Mother deliver the babies. And then when somebody died, she'd go and wash the body and prepare it for burial.
Did she do it for money then? Or was that
I think it was neighborly. Nobody thought of paying one another. What they did, well, even on the farm, they helped one another. Nobody paid. If you did a chore for somebody one day, maybe you needed a chore done for you, and that person would come and do it. Or else they do it for somebody else. It was one of those things. It was mutual agreement. When I was born, of course, Charlie was, how old was he? He must have been 20 years old. Anyway, I became his little pet. They went to school here in Minneapolis, and one of the old schools in northeast Minneapolis that they started school at was Humboldt School. When they were there, my aunt and my mother didn't like the principal there. She was pretty rough on the kids. So they decided they were going to quit that school because they heard there was a new school starting northeast, the Holland School, and they were going to go there. And in those days, there was no such thing as free school books. They had to buy them. So they took their books home. My aunt had her books under her little apron. They had an apron over their dress. She took them home, and they were going to go to the new school. So they did, and then when they got there, they found that the same old principal was going to be there. But then they got acquainted, and my mother fell in love with the new principal, and she became kind of her pet because she was sickly, and she took her. And then eventually the old school was torn down. There is a fire barn there northeast, where on 13th Avenue and about Main Street, the fire barn was built on the old school ground. Well, anyway, when my mother was about 13 years old, something happened to her. She fell, or what happened, but anyway, she got severe infection in one of her legs. And of course, if it be modern times, I'm sure they would diagnose it osteomyelitis, but they didn't. There was no such thing as, they didn't know about it. It wasn't discovered until World War I. Well, anyway, she went through that, and she was in bed for about a year trying to heal up from that. And eventually all the bones of her ankle came out. They worked themselves out. They were rotten. And, well, then when she was able to get up and be around again, she was on crutches. And then she never went back to school.
Oh, well, where did her education go then? Oh,
The sixth grade.
Sixth grade.
And, well, then she started to work and sew. She was, and then she worked with one of the neighbors there that was a dressmaker. And of course, Grandma could sew. But she went out and did it more or less professionally after that. But she was on her crutches. And then when she was 19 years old, everybody urged her to get that leg cut off and then get an artificial limb, and then she could walk without her crutches, which she did. And in those days, she visited all the hospitals to decide which hospital she was going to go to. And she decided that in those days, the only way they got out of the hospital was through the mortuary. They died. So I guess she was afraid of that. So she decided to have it done on their kitchen table in the kitchen. And there was an old Dr. Laliberty that did the actual cutting. And there again, they used chloroform for the anesthetic, and it was very gruesome, I guess. She was in bed for about a year, I guess. And it was after that that she started to go out to Hamel, and where she met my father.
Her health improved, though, after that.
Yes. Well, she didn't have the infection in the leg had healed, but it destroyed everything. But she went through life with her artificial leg. One of the things they did when they were courting, my father, either he'd bring the horses from the farm here with the buggy, or else they'd rent from a livery. I think it was more likely they'd rent the horses and a buggy, and then they'd go for a ride. And they used to go, one of the rides was around Lake Harriet. And their chaperone happened to be her little sister. Aunt Dora.
Yeah.
And she used to just hate to do that because there was nothing for her to do except to watch them and see that they didn't get in any trouble. They finally got married then on May 31st, 1897 at the Our Lady of Lourdes Church in southeast Minneapolis. It's still there. It's a historical landmark. And then they had their wedding dance out at Hamel. Then they went to live in the old farmhouse at Grandpa Hamel's, because Grandpa needed my father to help him on the farm. That's the way they did it. And then, of course, after they wanted to strike out on their own when they got a piece of land, they roamed around. They couldn't find their get their feet on the ground. Now, Archie was born. My oldest brother was born at Grandpa Hamel's house. He was born in January 26, 1898. They used to tell me he was premature. He was so tiny that she had him in a cigar box against his little. And he was very delicate all through his life. Two families didn't work out too good.
They were both living in the same house.
They were both in the same house. And then...
wasn't there a story that your mother and grandmother used to quarrel quite a bit too?
No, my mother was she was spoiled and sick so long. And every time Grandma talked, she thought she was throwing digs at her. And well, anyway, she didn't like her.
She didn't like her mother-in-law.
No. Then Grandpa set him up over to Roy's house. It would have been the grandma to
Marge, yeah.
Marge. It was her grandmother.
Marge Hagerness, her maiden
Yeah.
name was Roy.
Uh-huh. Well, anyway, they went and lived in some of the rooms that they had there. Well, then after that, they roamed around. They rented a farm near Ditter's Lake. It's on Highway 23 there, near the church of Sacred Heart, I guess. I think it's part of Wayzata now. Anyway, that's where Lil was born. She was born on May 30th, 1901. From Roy's that they went to Annandale. Yeah, they had the bakery there. It was at Annandale. My mother and my father, they both baked. And, well, the story went that Paul felt too sorry for so many people that couldn't afford to pay, and he'd give it away. So that didn't work out. And I think that's when they came back to Ditter's Lake.
How long were they in Annandale?
Not too long. And then another one, I think where you're thinking of Kimball, it was at Kidton. That was on the same trail, only further out. You see, they were on the old Sioux Line Railroad, where they could go to those places easily. And that follows Highway 55. Well, anyway, they were up there just a very short time, I think just over summer or something. My mother was too afraid of the prairie, and the weather. So then they came back, and I think that's when they came back, and Grandpa's became part of his land.
Where did they have the fire then?
Well, it was on part of his land. It was on Highway 101. And I think nowadays there's right on the farm site, there's a nursery.
Can you tell when it happened and what happened?
Well,
there?
I was a baby.
Okay, then you probably ought to go back, come to enter Dora then before you get to that.
Uh-huh. Well, I think she was born there in she was born on June 9th, 1905.
Aunt Dora.
Aunt Dora.
Her name was Medora too.
Medora, yes. But as she grew older, she thought the kids we all called her Dora, and that sounded so plain that she took on Doris. It was in those days that when Paul was in the village one time, that was the gathering place, and a young fella came in there and asked the grocerman if he knew some farmer that needed help, and that happened to be Charlie, 1905. Because he was there, and Doris was a little girl when I was born. Well, he was born in 1887. He was 11 years older than Archie. His birthday was January 27th, 1887. Well, anyway, he came to the house as a hired hand. His full name was Carl Heidenwag, but then there again, he didn't like the name of Heidenwag. It was too German, and he was very bitter with his father because when he left home, he had been beating him up so bad that he left home, and he didn't want anything German, and he loved our family, so he became Charlie, which is French, and then he dropped the G on the end of his name and put it, instead of having it Heidenwag, he had it Way. Well, anyway, that stuck till he died. His home was in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. His father had been a railroad man, and his mother had died when he was a baby, and the father had remarried, and it was a stepmother that, when his father had come home from a run on the railroad, all he heard was the mischief that Charlie got into, and then he'd whip him. So that's why he left.
So then he lived on your farm for a long, long time then.
Well, you see, that was in 1907 when I was born. Into the house too. Although there was a lot of music in our home at all times, because there was a lot of singing. My father had a beautiful voice. My mother did too. Archie was friends. Doris and Archie should have had their voices trained because they had such beautiful voices. Living there on the farm, one of the reasons why Charlie liked it, there was always people coming in, visiting, singing, music. and it was home for him. And one of the things that one time when he came home from visiting in Minneapolis, he came home with a little phonograph, and there was all kinds of records. It might have been a used one because they usually went to the pawn shops to buy stuff. And they didn't have much money. But it put more music in the home. Popular of the day. Some were hymns. It was mostly quiet music.
You were born at home.
Oh, we were all born at home.
Was it midwife?
No. There was a doctor in the town, Dr. Aubin. He lived in Hamel. He was married to a relative of one of my aunts. Maybe that's why he came from Canada and lived there. But anyway, he delivered, he was with my mother for Dora and I and Clarence, my youngest brother. The older ones, Lil and Archie, but they both had a doctor. They didn't go for the midwives. I think that was more with the immigrants that came from Europe later. But they had a doctor, I can't remember his name now, but he was from Wayzata. That was the one that came for the Hamel family when they Grandma had her babies. I don't think they ever had a midwife.
Did your mother lose any babies?
I think she had a miscarriage. That was always the bragging point, that she had 5 children and she raised them all. I guess I was a baby when one day, lo and behold, in the winter, in the late fall, the house burnt down.
Was it a chimney fire, or do they know?
Well, they think it was, in those days they had these little airtight, it was sheet steel, very thin steel, and they had a roaring fire going in there, and it was up in the bedrooms upstairs, you know, where we were going. They were trying to heat the bedrooms so we could go to bed. Well, they didn't know exactly how it started, but anyway, the house burned to the ground.
Nobody lost their life?
Nobody lost their life, and Charlie went up in the flames and threw down my mother's trunk, which had her baby clothes in. I suppose that was very treasured, and a lot of the pictures, and he threw down a few things. And one of the other hired men, they were so mad at him because all he thought about was a box of tobacco that it was wild tobacco that he had gathered that he was smoking, you know, from out in the fields. And he threw that down, and they never did get over it. Well, anyway, through the fire, well, my mother, she was so excited that she screamed so loud that they heard her way up in the village.
How far out of town were you?
Well, they must have been about 3 miles north of the town. And
Did it happen late in the evening then, or early evening?
well, it was before bedtime. Of course, then I suppose they had to go to Grandpa's, you know, they helped one another.
They didn't have any fire departments coming.
Oh, no. All they had, what was left when they had a fire, it was just like a death. Well, there was a pile of ashes the next day.
My name is Lucian Hamel, and I was born right here in Hamel, the town of Hamel. Fred Hamel is my older brother, and I'm the baby, the youngest of 10 children. Fred Hamel was a wonderful guy.
One of Fred's houses burned one time. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, it burnt out on the farm. I remember that.
Were you there at the time?
Well, I went it burnt during the night, and I went there in the morning. And I know that they ran short of water, and they poured milk on the fire, cans of milk, but it burned to the ground.
Well, then they rented the farm, was for rent across the road from that was Reese's. Now that's where they have the sugar bush, the maple sugar bush. And then there was very happy times there. You know, in time they forgot the fire and
Were they able to save any furniture?
no, I don't think they did.
That table that you gave us with the ball legs on it.
That probably came later. No, I think that came later.
so very little except her pictures. Were these pictures any of these?
No, these weren't in existence. Over at Reese's place, Charlie had made a bobsled, so there was hills there, so in the wintertime they used the bobsleds, and they had a beautiful time. You see, Charlie was like having an older brother, who in fact we always called him our brother, and he played with us, and and then the whole family would get into the bobsled, and then in the early spring, I guess along towards the end of February, first part of March, then they tapped the maple trees.
Did your dad do that too?
Oh yes, that was a thing they brought from Canada, and there was a lot of pictures. Charlie was always a camera butter, and I think he was the one that took all those pictures. And I think you have, on by the little shanty there where they boil the maple syrup. And it was from there. They had very good luck, good crops anyway.
What did they raise out there?
Well,
On that
diversified.
With livestock and
Yeah, everything.
crops?
Yeah, but you see now, they could still use the land my grandfather gave them, even if it didn't have the house on it.
So about how many acres was he farming upon?
I think around 80.
Did they have walk behind plow, or what kind of? How did he farm it? What did he have, a walk behind plow, or how did he?
Oh, they
farm
had
it?
horses.
Horse-drawn plow.
Oh, yes, they were very modern. You see, Grandpa, he was very businesslike. He didn't have much of an education, but he knew his farm, and they had very good luck. And
Your grandfather helped your dad a lot?
oh yes, they all helped. See, they taught one another. The young people didn't have the idea that they knew more than their parents. They listened. That was for everything, even for raising babies.
Did your dad have cows and pigs?
Oh yeah.
Sheep too?
No sheep. The sheep were too destructive. Just cows and pigs and lots of chickens. They had turkeys, lots of cats and dogs.
They didn't raise the cows for beef, then it was the milk. They raised.
Milk. The male cows that were born, or what would you call them? I guess the little male bulls. They were butchered. They weren't very old when they butchered them because they didn't want to feed them when they sold it for veal. And of course, the pigs, they usually raised them over summer. They kept enough to give them a crop in the first spring, but the ones that were full grown towards fall, they butchered. And that's when my mother would make blood sausage and the various sausages, that could keep in the wintertime. And of course, that was when they made the tortillas that were so famous. Christmas was a religious holiday. We went to church, and it was to see which one in the family that had given to my mother and father the first, to wish them a Merry Christmas in the morning. And there weren't many gifts. Usually my mother would put out the toys that we had the year before, and maybe we'd get an apple and an orange or some candy. There was very little. And
Was that because they were poor, or just because
no,
it was not traditional?
That was the way it was.
They weren't real poor at that time.
Well, no, they weren't. My mother's father had made some toys. Now, one of the things that was lost in the fire, he had made her a dresser, a little doll dresser, and that burned in the fire. But then of course we had a feasting through the day.
On Christmas.
On Christmas, my mother would always roast chicken, to be stuffed and roasted. She always did that, even after we were older. On Christmas, though, the relatives had come and they'd make the rounds. It was like open house, and there was always a little glass of wine, and the men had a little brandy. I don't know how polluted they were when they got through visiting, but by the time they came, there was never any heavy drinking. Never.
Did the relatives come from Minneapolis too, or just from
No,
Hamel?
it was around the Hamel. New Year's, then that was another big day. That was really with the French, that was more of the celebration.
Do you remember anything between the time you were born and the time Uncle Clarence was born? Or you were too
Oh,
small?
no. You see, there was only 2.5 years between us. But then when he was born, on October 19th, 1909, he was such a great big baby. The doctor propped him up on a chair there, and he told Lil that was her baby.
Is it a born baby?
He was awfully big.
How do you walk,
Well, they said he was 14 pounds, but of course I don't know whether the doctor hefted him or... He was a great big baby. It was in 1910 then. They had, after the harvest, my father, they had a very good year, and my father wanted to go visit relatives who had went with the immigrant trains to Washington when they were opening it up for settling. They went in 1898, but this was 1910, and my father wanted to go visit them. They did very, very well in Washington with the lumber. My father's aunt, it was Grandpa's sister, her name was Euphemia. Of course, she was Euphemia Hamel. She had married twice, but then the first husband died. The second husband was Campbell, and that's when she made the killing with. And that's where he was going to visit. Well, when he got out there, he was just dazzled. He just fell in love with everything. You know, a country boy, had never been to the city, outside of visiting Minneapolis occasionally. And, well, anyway, when he come home, he went alone. Of course, in those days, the men did things alone. Anyway, he come home and he told my mother. He told her, we're moving out to Washington. She didn't quite believe that he was serious. You know, the men were the head of the home in those days, and they dictated everything. So, well, anyway, she realized he meant business when she saw somebody else driving his horse, one of his horses in the village. He had sold it already. By October then, they were on their way to Washington. They took a lot of the farm produce. They rented a whole boxcar from the railroad, the Sioux line. They had the cows and the I think they just took 2 cows and some pigs and chickens. There was a lot of chickens. And the furniture, they took all the furniture, and they were moving. And of course somebody had to go with that to feed the livestock. So Charlie was chosen to go. You see, he had stayed with us.
Did he live right in the boxcar?
He lived in the boxcar, and you know, it took 3 weeks from Hamel, where they loaded, to get to Washington, because they went, I guess they went all over Canada to, you know, on the Sioux line tracks, because that's the one that used to go up by Winnipeg and along that way. We went on the Sioux line, of course, and in those days it took about 3 days and 3 nights. They had to sleep on the train, but then they brought their food. In those days they had an old cook stove at the end of the car, you know, where you could heat your stuff. The porters kept that going, you know, hot. Well, anyway, when we got to Seattle, of course, we went to Aunt Campbell's. That was where we landed. Clarence was a year old the next day. So we got there October 18th, 1910.
Can you remember any of the experiences on the train while you were going?
No, I didn't remember that. You see, the only thing I remember before I went, I was playing in the living room barefooted, and I stepped on a needle. My mother she was always sewing or embroidering or something, and she must have dropped this needle on the floor. And I stepped on it, and I remember yanking it out, only I broke it before I was 3. That first winter was very, very hectic for us.
Did you stay at Campbell's the whole time then?
No, we rented a place. And then my mother had relatives there in Tacoma that we visited.
What was their name?
The LaFave. The father there was my mother's uncle. He was Grandpa LaFave's brother.
What was his name, do you remember?
Ulrich. Anyway, he had a family too. Ann Campbell lived in Ballard. It was a suburb of Seattle. And then we went over to, they rented a place there in Ballard. It was a house. And of course, I guess we ate all the chickens that year.
Your dad worked
He worked at for Uncle Campbell then, and of course coming there as they didn't show any favorites, and Paul was so discouraged with the mill. Yeah, he cut his finger. He cut the tip of his finger off, and of course in those days there was no such thing as workman's comp. My mother had to bandage it up, and he went back to work, and that finger, well, I guess it finally grew some skin on afterward. And then I got sick. I had pneumonia, and they thought I was going to die. I was very, very sick. Anyway, I had this pneumonia. The doctor came, but he gave up on it. You know, in those days, pneumonia was they used to call that the chief of the men at death. It was the main cause, or rather the top one of killing. Well, anyway, my mother, he told her, he says, well, you can put her on a couch on the porch where she can have air. See, there was no such thing as giving oxygen. She didn't do that, though. She didn't want me outside. And I don't know just how long afterwards, a peddler came to the door, somebody selling stuff. I don't remember what it was, going door to door, selling stuff, and my mother was crying, and he asked her why. I guess he forgot what he was selling, but anyway, he asked her why she was crying, and she told him, and he said, well, he knew a good remedy for that. And he told her to give me some kerosene. Anyway, she thought I was going to die anyway, so she gave it to me. And it worked.
My mouth?
Oh yeah, you drank it. I don't think it was the same kerosene as you would have today. I think it was made for something else. It wasn't a cool oil. It was kerosene. You know, everybody had that because you had the lamps, you had, you know, you used it so much. But anyway, I recovered, and this was in 1911. Along towards, fall, I guess it was, towards winter, they were getting nowhere, and my father was so discouraged, and my mother was crying all the time. It just didn't work. And then finally, of course,
Charlie doing all this time?
Charlie was there. He was living with us. He was a boarder.
Did he work in the mill too?
He worked in the mill too, and he went and worked for Hamel, who was a cousin of mine. They both did very well out there. You remember Agnes's husband?
Emil was the son
of one of Grandpa's brothers. His name was Lounge. He came from his father. Pa then decided that maybe he better go back to farming. So, well, anyway, he got after my mother to sell the farm here so they could reinvest out there. So she held out for a long time. And then, of course, Uncle Bert his brother wanted him too. My mother held out for a whole day. Finally, Charlie, Pa kept telling her he was going to leave home. He was twisting her arm so she'd sign. See, she had to sign. And well, finally, Charlie says, well, if you want to keep a husband, you better sign. So, well, anyway, she decided then that she didn't know how serious he was. She had 5 little children. In those days, there was no such thing as divorce or ADC. You were on your own. Well, anyway, she signed the paper, and Uncle Bert bought it. Grandpa Hamel wanted to keep the land and the family. So then they didn't know where to go, what to do, so they went down to Hayward, California. They rented a farm there first before they wanted to see whether they wanted. It wasn't too far from San Francisco, because I know we've stayed in San Francisco about buying this farm in Hayward, but they rented it for a while after the 60s. And it was out on a hill, and oh my mother was so lonesome. You might as well have been in the end of the world. She cried all the time. And I remember getting these avocado pears. And then there was another kind, that kind of rusty looking pears. You know, it was fruit in there. Hayward wasn't too far from.
Was he going to be a fruit farmer then, or a livestock farmer? Or
I don't know what he was going to be. I don't think he knew himself.
what
he
made him
was
decide to go down to California?
He had heard, about California, and gold was discovered not too far from there, by Sacramento. I remember the trip back from Hayward, because it lasted very short, because we all got deathly sick there, very sick. And they said that the place had a siege of hog cholera. The people that had left there. So anyway, we went back. My mother says home. By that time she liked Seattle. So we went back, and I remember the trip on the train going back, because Doris was so sick. And there was, must have been some guy from India that was on that train. Anyway, he had a turban on, and he told my mother that what she should do for that sick girl was to try and put that kind of a hot poultice, for on her chest. And, when we got back to Ballard, that's what she did. And then I remember going by Mount Shasta. The train stopped there, and then, of course, Archie and my father ran out and got some water. It was mineral water from the spring there in Mount Shasta. It was late.